So again, this week we're in a different setting, but we're in the same series, Gospel Culture, because again, whether or not we have a building, we're still the church. We're still the local expression of God's calling all kinds of people to himself. And the most attractive thing about us, about who we are, isn't a building that we meet in, it's not the kind of music that we play or how innovative we are, or even the causes that we're about. The most important thing about us as God's people gathered into a church is that we display the character of God to one another and to a world of people who are looking for him. What we proclaim and what we preach about God and his gospel is vital. It's vital for us to be a church. We've seen that our culture, our life together collectively as a people is important and vital as well. How we, out of our experience with the good news of the gospel, with the good news of Jesus, how we display God's love and his grace, his kindness, his patience, his joy, and so much more towards each other. So we've called that a gospel culture, which comes from, again, I don't have much room up here, this little green book written by Pastor Ray Ortlund. We'll have a few more copies of those if you're interested in reading it. But that's what we've been talking about in this series about gospel culture. And just recently, we've talked about how this looks like bearing one another's burdens, how it looks like moving towards each other with a kind of restorative gentleness and empathy. And last week, we talked about how because God is light, it means that you and I can live with a culture of honesty. We can live in the light. We can walk honestly before him and with each other and experience real joy and true fellowship. That's what's waiting for us as we live in and display this kind of gospel culture. That's what's waiting for us if we commit to pursuing a gospel culture in this way. And so gospel culture, isn't this sort of utopian idea either. It's not going to be perfect. Our relationships and our culture together right now in here in this world isn't going to be perfect or free from discomfort or hardship or hurt. We're going to have difficult conversations. They're going to be messy situations. But this, a culture that is saturated and shaped by the gospel, is Jesus' plan for renewing all things. The church is God's plan A for showing his redemptive plan of what he is going to accomplish in the entire created order. And so what we know and what we can be assured of is that Jesus is enveloping our relationships with his love and with his power. Jesus stands on the outside of our relationships together as the church, reinforcing them, sustaining them, pouring life into them to see to it that we won't ever be separated from God and that we don't have to truly be separated from each other. And so if we believe that, we can see that God is at work. God is actively and powerfully at work in our culture in these kind of ordinary settings and interactions that we have with one another. Although it's regular and ordinary and basic in the way that we serve one another and love one another and show kindness to one another and pray for one another, God is displaying something powerful, not just to us, but also to this world about what he is going to accomplish. The question for us, brothers and sisters, is will we commit to this way? Will we commit to this way? So this week we're looking at a culture of peace. A culture of peace and what it means for us to be a church that looks at the good news of our being reconciled to God through Jesus and then extends this same peace and reconciliation towards each other. So we look around this world that we live in, right? And we could say that we need a culture of peace, especially right now. Our world, our context, even our nation is probably more divided than it's ever been or that it's been in a really long time. Division is everywhere these days, and people are divided over things that are major and things that are minor. Politics, race, face masks, theological disagreements, and applications. Divisions exist around us. They've always existed, and they will continue to exist in this world. And it's not like churches are these sort of peaceful or neutral places where we sort of escape the division that's around the world. And we're just kind of these sort of neutral people who are just trying to navigate. when we go back out there. No, division can also exist within our churches. Division can affect us as well. The church can often be just as divided as the world around us by many of the same things as we are seeing. So what we see is the divisions and tensions don't come out of nowhere as much as they're exposed. These things sort of rise to the surface when the world around us and the world that we live in is shaken, or something comes about. And so having a gospel culture of peace, it doesn't mean that we're free from differences. It doesn't mean that we're free from having different perspectives and understandings or ideas. It doesn't even mean that we're free from the things that might divide us. Having a gospel culture of peace means that the peace that we have in Jesus, the peace that we're going to read about in Ephesians chapter 2, is stronger than any of our divisions and differences. And the way we engage one another with this peace and in this peace means that we don't have to be divided and separated. So we don't want to be the kind of place that believes that we are just sort of neutral when it comes to being divided. We want to recognize that we are just as capable of being divided and experiencing division as anybody else. But we do want to be a place that responds to division effectively in a gospel way that, again, sees our relationships as enveloped by the person and work of Jesus. And so when division and differences come along, we don't have to leave the room. We don't have to separate. We can see that God's love that will not allow us to be separated from him is also there to sustain us and not allow us to separate from each other. So whenever we encounter division, we can so often foster a hollow kind of unity and even a false peace, right? One that avoids division and difficult conversations or tries to ignore or minimize real problems that even need to be addressed. Sometimes, in the name of peace, we want to rush to avoid conflicts or even rush to produce a kind of peaceful outcome. It's one way that we respond to division, right? Or on the other hand, sometimes we might double down and force a kind of unity by drawing harder lines in the sand to try to compel people to conform to our ideals and expectations. So in a world of division, it's easy. The church is right to show and display a gospel culture of peace because by default, as human beings, everyone in this world is more prone to division, to moving towards and gravitating towards division, away from God and away from each other. But the good news of the gospel, what we're going to see in gospel doctrine before we look at gospel culture, is that Jesus comes into this world to reconcile people who are divided from God, but also divided from each other. And we don't have to settle for a false peace or hollow calls to unity, but we can have a real peace with one another, with God and with one another through the gospel, and be able to move towards one another even in our differences, even amidst the potential things that threaten to divide us. So from Ephesians chapter 2, verses 13 through 16, we're going to look at the gospel doctrine of reconciliation and then see what this means for us in light of who Jesus is and what he's done. See what it means for us to pursue a culture of peace. So let's look at these verses. Right, they're written to a divided people. That's who Paul is writing this letter to. Churches in the region of Ephesus, people who are Jewish and non-Jews, who are also known as Gentiles, people from all kinds of other nations. These people are divided people. They're divided spiritually, but also ethnically. See, many Gentiles, again, people who were of non-Jewish ethnicity, they had come to trust in the Jewish God, Yahweh, through the person and work of his son, Jesus, who's lived perfectly in their place, died sacrificially for their sins and their crimes against God. God's forgiven them, and how God has brought them near and drawn them into his family, adopting them. They've believed and trusted in Jesus, and they've been reconciled with God. But before Jesus came into this world, what we saw and the situation was, and the situation which Paul writes to them, is this: that Jewish peoples weren't very welcoming to Gentile peoples, and vice versa. But particularly within Judaism and the Jewish religion, Jewish peoples were not very welcoming to peoples of other nations and ethnicities, and often regarded them as what verses 11 through 12 say, as spiritually inferior, unclean, excluded and separated from God, foreigners and aliens, as even some translations say, separated from God and apart from God with no hope. And certainly some of this is true. The peoples of every nation who didn't align themselves with Israel's God were separated from him, and ultimately they were without hope because they did not believe God. But what the Jews did, they took this truth, they even took God's law, and they used it to elevate themselves and subjugate Gentile peoples. And that played out in all kinds of ways, in their culture, in their laws, in their life. It played out systemically. Many times they discriminated against Gentile peoples in every area of Jewish life and culture, which more than anything, it caused hostility between Jews and Gentiles. Hostility that's not foreign to us at all, right? We see this kind of hostility in nations all over the world, and even within our particular context in this country. Division breeds hostility. Sin enters into this world and it divides people. So this is the situation for everyone in this world. It's the situation that all of us are in this room, on one side of the divide or the other, separating ourselves or being separated from. We face all kinds of divisions that produce all kind of hostility, but the point of Ephesians chapter 2 is this, is that there's probably no deeper division that you've experienced than this one that Paul highlights here. If we put ourselves into this passage and ask who we are, we're in this room as well, we are Gentiles. All of us are people from nations who aren't Jewish, who aren't Israel, who were separated from God and were without hope. We'd be the ones described here as hopeless and foreigners without God. And so when we bring this into our context, and we look at our divisions that aren't based on these types of things, but maybe based on all other kinds of things that I mentioned earlier. Whoever's on the other side of your dividing line, brothers and sisters, whatever that line is, be it politics or race or cultural preferences or even theological perspectives, however far you believe they are from you, and whatever hostility exists, whatever deep division that you can imagine and picture in your mind right now that causes you to be separated from other people, you and I, we were light years away in comparison from God because of sin. That is all of our situation. We were separated from God. We were on the wrong side of the divide when it came to him because of our sin. And there was nothing that we could do to close or to mend that gap. There's nothing that we could do to close that division. So brothers and sisters, look, that's not to minimize some of our very real divisions, because sometimes the things that actually do divide us are deep and hurtful. They're complex. They're not easily resolved or reconciled. But the gospel gives us a perspective and an awareness of a greater division that everyone in this world, particularly us as followers of Jesus, a division that we all experience when it comes to God. The gospel brings an awareness and an honest perspective about who we are and where we are apart from God, separated from him. But it also gives us hope. That's what verses 1 through 3 tell us of Ephesians chapter 2. Paul says that we too all were children of disobedience and God's wrath, which means that we were outsiders. We were on the wrong side of the divide. So, brothers and sisters, what are your divisions? What are the things that cause you to be separated from people? Where are your lines drawn? Who are the people on the other side of those lines? And what would it take for people to be reconciled to you? What do you think it would take for you to be reconciled to others? What would it take for true peace to be achieved? Well, again, Ephesians tells us that in our being separated from God, there's nothing that we could do to solve our hopelessness and our separation. There's nothing that you and I could do to fix this state of our being separated from God and being unclean, foreigners, far off from his covenant and his family. And we see through the gospel that God acts proactively and graciously when we don't deserve it. Look at verse 13. It says, "But now in Christ Jesus, you who were far away have been brought near." You who were far away have been brought near. And this is the good news, that because Jesus has come into this world, sent by his Father, he has come to do something about this division that all of us experience. He's come to do something about this division, but he actually brings far people who are far off, he brings them near. And notice, this isn't this meeting in the middle. This isn't Jesus coming down into this world and waiting for people to come to him. No, he comes all the way across this bridge, this divide, and he takes people who were hostile and resistant, even people, as Paul says in Ephesians 2, who were dead and unresponsive in their trespasses and sins, separated from God, and he brings them. He throws them over his shoulder, and he brings them across the bridge into God's family. He is proactive in mending and closing this divide. It is God's action that bridges the division that we created. God isn't obligated to do this, and yet this is what he does. And he doesn't meet us halfway. He doesn't give us a list of demands or things to try to accomplish before he makes peace. He doesn't say, these are the terms of which I want you to meet before you and I can actually experience peace. He comes into this world. He takes dead people who are unresponsive and even hostile to him, and he brings them near and transforms them. And in this, we see God's love and his power to do for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. But even more than that, we see God's nearness to us and his proximity, because he does this by not sitting abstractly outside of this world and maybe sending some kind of ambassador or some kind of person who could just communicate. He sends himself, his son, into this world to communicate peace, to proclaim this good news of peace. God the Son puts on flesh. He lives his life among us, experiencing our fallen nature and our weakness. And he moves towards those who are on the other side of the very big divides. He involves himself not just in our separation from God, but also in our separation from each other. He moves towards the people that were so often separated from others, particularly in this day. You remember his mission. He says the Spirit of God has anointed him to proclaim the good news to the poor, right? Those who were separated, the captives, those who were separated, those who were blind, the outcasts. Jesus engages those who were on the other side of the big divides. The Samaritan woman, the unclean and the leprous, he touches them. The sinful and the outcast. People like the thief on the cross. The people who were told that they were the furthest away from God, for whatever reason, are the people that Jesus proactively moved towards in a reconciling way, bringing them near. And so on one level, we see that he does this genuinely for them in his benevolence, in his goodness, in his kindness, and his love. But he also does this with spiritual significance to show his mission of peace. He does this as a signpost to show how God himself, through Jesus, has moved towards the people who weren't looking for him, those who were not a part of his family, those who were not a part of the larger society. He goes and gets them and brings them near. He does for them what they cannot do for themselves. This is why you and I are here today, right? As Gentiles. God has done for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. God has brought us near when we were far off through the person and work of his Son. And again, he doesn't do this in an abstract way. He leans all the way in. He leans all the way in doing this, giving up his life, sacrificing himself. Notice Ephesians says it's by his blood that our peace is accomplished. Jesus sacrifices himself so that real peace and real reconciliation can be achieved. We've been brought near by the blood of Christ. And so vertically speaking, the sin that separated us from God and its punishment has been put on Jesus. The shame and the guilt that we bear for breaking God's law and pushing ourselves away from God, dividing ourselves from him, turning our backs on him. While we were sinners, Jesus dies for us as a supreme demonstration of God's love. The hostility towards God that existed within us, within our hearts, the hostility that we express towards him has been overcome through Jesus. His blood has removed our sin, its penalty, and its power, and God has reconciled us to him. He's given us real peace with him. He's given us his Spirit. He's accepted us. That's vertically. Horizontally, the blood of Jesus that's reconciled sinful people to God also reconciles divided people to each other. Meaning that when we come into the family of God, through the person and work of Jesus, when Jesus throws your sinfully dead corpse over his shoulder and brings you to the Father and causes you to be alive and called his son or his daughter, when Jesus does that, we have a transformed perspective of how we see each other. We have a transformed perspective of how we see ourselves. We look at one another and we see that not only was I a former enemy of God who was totally unresponsive and hostile to him, but so were you. And God went all the way out of his way. Matter of fact, it was his way to bring you to himself. And he did that in love and grace and kindness. The division that existed between you and him, he squashed. So whatever division that exists between us doesn't have to have the final say. We have peace with God, but also with one another. And we engage each other from the perspective that if God has brought us near to himself, overcoming and conquering our hostility and making peace amidst a deep division, then you and I can have peace even in our lesser divisions. Brothers and sisters, there was no greater division that existed or that exists than the division that is between God and sinful people. And God moves powerfully and proactively to reconcile his enemies to himself, to squash the hostility, to look it in the face, to not give an issue a hollow call to peace, to not set really complex and difficult terms and wait for us, but he achieves peace. He achieves real peace for us in Jesus. And because of this, we can ask ourselves, well, what are we waiting for? What keeps us from pursuing real peace with one another as brothers and sisters in the family of God? But even more than that, peace with everyone. That's what a gospel culture looks like. So we see the gospel doctrine of reconciliation, but now let's look at gospel culture. Again, we usually don't have any problem of grasping how Jesus is our peace and how he's reconciled us to God. We rejoice in that. We love that. We love to hear that over and over and over. God has made peace with us. The problem that we often run into is peace with each other, right? People aren't God. God is good. People, So what does this look like for us to have peace? What does this look like for us to have peace Ask yourself that question right now, August 29th in 2021, after 2020, even in 2021, with all of the division that we see going around us. What does peace really, really look like? I have asterisks around that beside really in my notes. What does it look like to really have a culture of peace in a really divided world? Where we are constantly either divided or threatened to be divided by really simple things, right? Really simple things or really major things. The problem isn't with the things, it's us. How do people who still have indwelling sin, who are still prone to wander from Jesus, how do we really have peace? Even though we are followers of Jesus in the family of God. How is it that even amongst Jesus' followers, you have someone like Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector getting along? I don't know. How is it that they stay together for 3 years following Jesus? What does that even look like? Well, when it comes to a gospel culture, all of these characteristics that we're talking about, all of these characteristics that we've looked at throughout this series, they're going to be displayed by us in a very imperfect way. Empathy, honesty, life, inclusion, hope. But probably more than these, our displaying and even pursuing a culture of peace is something that we might not even see a whole bunch of fruit from. It's a process. It's an imperfect process. One where we might never actually see the outcome. Because peace involves two parties, right? We can't reach into somebody's heart like God does and extend this kind of peace and transform them. And that's our problem, right? That's what we want to do. We want to change people before we have peace with them. But what this means for us to have a gospel culture of peace is to see reconciliation as a posture, to look at ourselves, to see our great need for peace with God, to be constantly reminded of that and remember that, and then to turn that on its side and extend an open hand to others. My brothers and sisters, that won't always be reciprocated. That won't always work out like we imagine that it should. And that's difficult. More than that, there's no one specific way to pursue peace. Sure, we have the ideals, right, of singing Kumbaya and holding hands and everybody getting along, whatever that means. We don't always know what peace might actually look like, and there are different ways to pursue peace. But we can be committed to the process. We can be committed to the concept and the ideal because we have received and we know something of true peace. And on our part, as much as it depends on us, right? Hebrews 12, chapter 14 says, strive for peace with everyone. We can strive for it. We can work hard. We can labor. We can sacrifice. It's not easy. Sometimes peace calls you to die before you are resurrected in a relationship. We can strive for it. And look at the way that Jesus has striven for peace with us, giving up his own life. And not just model that, but see our experience with that. We would not have peace with God if Jesus didn't die. So what's that look like for you to reach across the dividing line and pursue peace with someone who you are divided from? Romans chapter 12, verse 18 says, if it is possible, because it won't always be possible, but if it is possible, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Live at peace with Christians. Everyone. In 2021, when we're divided by race and politics and face masks, and we're divided by so many major and minor things, your family members, your neighbors, your friends, the people in the other party, the people at the other church, the people who've hurt you and wounded you, who cause you to want to be separated. People will make you think that you want to leave Jesus sometimes. If it is possible, follower of Jesus, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Hebrews 12, right? Strive for peace with everyone. We are to be a people marked by peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. It's in our DNA. It's who we are. This transformative power that's taken work in the message of the gospel, it makes us peacemakers. We pursue peace as much as it depends on us. That's our default reaction. That's just how we do. Again, we don't do it perfectly. Matter of fact, we actually do it pretty poorly, as we're seeing in many places, even in ourselves today, in divided times. So what these verses communicate to us is that a culture of peace where there's no more strife or disagreement and where there's perfect unity may not always be possible here in this world. A true culture of peace is only going to happen in a full manifestation when Jesus makes everything new. But until that happens, brothers and sisters, as God's people, the question for us is, will we be committed to striving for it? Will we be committed to working together to pursue peace and doing everything possible as much as it depends on us to live peaceably with everyone? Will that be the culture that people encounter when they come into this church? That's major. Will that be the culture that people, your neighbors, your friends, your family members, people who you know who don't follow Jesus, will that be what they encounter when they encounter you? Again, that's what these verses highlight. The peace that we are called to pursue is apologetic. It says something to the world, not just to us, about the character of God and how he reconciles with sinful people, with his enemies. Again, not just in a way that waits for them to meet him in the middle, but in a sacrificially proactive way that brings them near. What does it look like for you to bring those on the other side of the divide, those who differ from you? What does it look like for you to bring them near as much as it's possible for you? There are people who are not followers of Jesus who feel like outsiders when they come into places like this. They don't know the Christianese, the lingo, or the language. They haven't been to church in a really long time. Maybe they've been repelled by Christians, people like us. What does it look like for us to extend the hand of peace as much as possible on us, and to demonstrate the reconciling peace that Jesus has accomplished for us? Again, pursuing peace looks different in different situations. But listen, the question for us, brothers and sisters, are we unwilling to be satisfied with cold relationships and states of indifference towards each other? It's really easy to do that, particularly in these days, to just draw the line and say, well, them people are going to go their way. I'm not going to go after them. I'm not going to pursue them. We can justify it with all kinds of reasons. Are we unwilling to be satisfied with cold relationships and states of indifference towards each other? Are we willing to not just stop at a false peace that's only the absence of tension, right? Where things are okay, nobody's really at each other's necks, that's fine. We just won't talk about the difficult things. We just won't bring up the really hard questions and realities. We'll just keep quiet and we'll therefore maintain this kind of false peace. But are we willing? Are we willing in the pursuit of peace to have hard conversations? To admit that we're wrong, to apologize, or to even stand up for what's right? To pursue justice, righteousness. In this world and in the church, divisions will come up, and they'll be exposed in us and among us. That's life. That's this fallen world that we live in. But a gospel culture of peace for followers of Jesus determines how we will respond. Brothers and sisters, again, it'd be really easy to just pursue peace by just throwing out the cliches of we're one, Jesus is our peace, just like the scriptures say, and just tell everybody to just believe that more. But how do we actively maintain a culture of peace? Here's the one thing that I'll leave you with today. Ultimately, it means that we recognize that peace isn't something that we're achieving as the people of God. Peace isn't something that we are working towards. Look at Ephesians. It says that Jesus is our peace. Now, he will one day become our peace. Not that if you do the right things, he will be peace for you. He is our peace. Peace isn't something that we're achieving on our own or working towards. That's the difference between how the church pursues peace and how we see peace trying to be pursued in the world around us. They're working towards peace. They're working towards unity. We have it. It's been purchased for us as the church. He is our peace. That's the reality. That's the banner. We're just trying to figure out what it looks like to live in light of this. We have peace. Jesus has bought it. It will come to pass. He's the ground and the foundation upon which we can know that we are not in a hostile relationship with God, and that hostility doesn't have to define our relationships with our brothers and sisters. Jesus, right? He's the protective building or the house in which all of our life together as his people is lived. And that includes our divisions, our confrontations, our arguments, our differences, our pains, our hurts. As brothers and sisters and as the family of God, we might not always be in the same room or in each other's faces, but peace means that we are in the same family. We are a part of the same family. And so how we engage and interact with one another looks different. No matter what the outcome is of our differences and even the things that might divide us, we still see each other as brothers and sisters, those who God has gone the lengths to bring near to himself. And therefore we say, man, I love you as a brother and a sister in the family of God. No matter how we differ or disagree, this is the ground upon which I am engaging you with and on. We see each other from that perspective. The person who is on the other side of the divide is a redeemed, forgiven child of God who's been brought near to God and who God is committed to transforming. We're seeing that we have peace that's already been achieved for us and we're not working towards it. And we can only take that posture in our horizontal relationships with each other when we have experienced Jesus as our peace in our vertical relationship with God. Brothers and sisters, we are never going to see or pursue real peace in our own capacity. It's just not going to happen. We all have a threshold. We all have that battery bar that's just gone to the limit sometimes when it comes to divisions. Will you receive and drink from the eternal fountain of peace that God has invited and extended you an invitation to through Jesus? Because if you do, and if you've experienced that, you can extend a real and a genuine peace to others, even people who you disagree with the most. And that has been purchased for us by Jesus' blood. Ray Ortlund says this. He says, we prove our sincerity about the vertical gospel of reconciliation through our willingness to move towards horizontal relationships that need reconciliation. Maybe that person or that church or that group won't listen to us, but still we must try. And we might be surprised at how God blesses our imperfect but prayerful effort. And so, again, even though I can't paint for you a picture of what a culture of peace looks like, especially in a divided age, practically, we can ask ourselves the really hard questions. Who is it that we're keeping our distance from? Who are we avoiding? Who are we hoping that we won't run into around town? Whose presence makes us feel awkward because of some painful history? Who might we owe an apology? Ray Ortlund says this, that if we say we love the gospel of reconciliation, can we let any relational breakdown go on and on without at least trying to reconcile? That's what it means for us to have a culture of peace, a posture of reconciliation. As much as it depends on us, if the church collectively is committed to this reality because of how we've experienced Jesus, that's going to be different than what we see in the world. That's going to say something about the character of God and the lengths that he's gone to actually achieve peace with people like us who really need it. Let me pray for us.